Alright. Morning people again, it's currently 9:04 a.m. Friday, March 21, 2025. So before I jump into my studies of my class, I'm going to read one chapter in Common Stocks as Long-Term Investments by Edgar Lawrence Smith. And I'm at chapter 12 right now, but if you guys are interested in me reading the prior chapters for you instead of you purchasing it or looking for it online, I can do that for you because it's a community I'm trying to build where we learn together, we grow together, we earn together, right? So, chapter 12, fluctuations in bond values. In the various tests we have made of the relative long-term investment values of common stocks and bonds, we purposely avoided any emphasis upon the weaker aspects of an investment confined to bonds, in order that the results of our tests might not be subject to question. It is now desirable to draw another picture showing the real hazards in an investment confined to mature obligations. It is generally recognized that common stocks are subject to changes in market value, which may be at times rapid. But it is not so generally recognized that bonds and mortgages are subject to changes in real value, almost as drastic as stocks. Rarely as rapid, but perhaps more insidious, in that they are not so easily appraised. The words bond and mortgage have for so long connoted security and safety, while the word stock has been so widely accepted as synonymous with risk and hazard, that an investor feels he is necessarily acting with more prudence and conservatism when he buys bonds and mortgages than when he buys stocks. So they must say bonds are probably considered more safe than buying very obscure or unsure volatility of stocks. Yet frequently this is not the case. Let us then examine the underlying forces which affect the investment value of long-term bonds. If we do this in connection with our studies of common stocks, we can hardly fail to see that we have still further grounds for the belief that under proper diversification, common stocks deserve to have a far better long-term investment rating than is usually accorded them. So bonds 1902 to 1920, it's like a case study. So a purchaser in April 1902 of Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe General 4% bonds due 1995, or of New York Central and Hudson River Railroad 3.5% bonds due 1997 would have fared as follows if he had been forced to sell these bonds in July 1920. So it's like a little table with headings like Atchison 4s and Central 3.5s. And for purchase price April 1902 for Atchison 4s it's 103.5. For Central 3.5 it's 109. Basis if held to maturity 3.87% for Atchison and 3.2% for Central. Same basis July 1920, 103 for Atchison and 108.5 for Central. Market price July 1920 was 71 for Atchison and 62 for Central. Loss 32 points for Atchison, 46.5 points for Central. Percent of purchase price lost 31% for Atchison, 42.9% for Central. Percent of purchase price still held 69% Atchison and 57.1% Central. But they're both bonds though. But the dollar in 1920 had only 37% of the purchasing power of the dollar of 1902. Therefore, depreciation occurred. So the money in 1920 was worth less than the money in 1902. So that the real value remaining to the investor of what he actually invested in 1902 was as follows. So Atchison General 4s, 69% times 37% equal 25.53%, and New York Central 3.5s, 57.1% times 37%, which is equal to 21.13%. In other words, he would have lost over 74% of the principal value of his investment in Atchison bonds and over 78% of his investment in New York Central bonds. And none of this loss would have been due to any impairment in the credit position of these companies. These illustrations, while extreme, focus attention on two elements of risk that exist even in the highest grade of bonds, in addition to the element which is given most prominence by a majority of those who offer bonds for sale. So one, depreciation of the dollar, and two, a general increase in current interest rates. The third element, which exists in some degree in all bonds and is most frequently discussed, is three, the change in credit position of the debtor company. So the credit position of a company is subject to change over a period of years, either through changes in management or policies, or through changes in the underlying price, wage, social, and industrial factors upon which prosperity of the company depends. In the case of the two bonds cited, we have instances of heavy loss in principal value sustained by the holder of bonds of the highest character, due to an increase in the general interest rate and a coincidental lowering of the purchasing power of the dollar. There was no weakening of the credit position of the issuing companies. These bonds have since recovered a part of their price loss due to a falling in the general interest rate since 1920, and have further regained a part of their lost principal value through an increase in the purchasing power of the dollar. But it may be many years before a holder of these bonds purchased in 1902 will recover the full purchasing power of the funds originally invested. There are bonds, moreover, which during the same period lost not only on account of the two causes first named, but in addition on account of the third cause, a change for the worse in the credit position of the issuing company. So two such may be cited: Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Consolidated Mortgage 4%, due 1989, bought in April 1902 at 116, a basis to yield if held to maturity 3.4%. Such a price was justified only on the supposition that the bonds were entirely free from any risk of loss in principal value from any cause. In the case of this bond, all three of the hazards that pertain to bond investments came into play between the date of purchase and July 1920, with the result that the bonds were quoted in that month at 60, a basis to yield of 6.70%. This represented a loss as expressed in dollars as follows. So Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Consolidated Mortgage 4% due 1989. Purchase price April 1902, 116. Basis if held to maturity 3.4%. Same basis July 19, 116. Market price July 1920, 60. Loss 56 points. Percent of purchase price lost 48.2%. Percent of original investment still held 51.72%. But the purchasing power of the dollar in 1920 was only 37% of that for the dollar in 1902. 37% times 51.72% is equal to 19.14%. Therefore, the actual purchasing power of the proceeds of the sale of this bond in 1920 would be less than 20% of the purchasing power of the original investment, a loss of over 80%. Another example of the operation of all three factors against the integrity of an investment in bonds, which were considered high grade at the time of purchase, is found in the following bond of the New Haven system. In purchasing power, the principal value of the original investment declined in this case by 85%. An improvement in the credit position of the issuing company obviously favors the principal value of the investment in its bonds. but the latter is only one of three main considerations, and it may be interesting to show how it failed to offset the other two in the extreme period we have been considered. For this purpose, we have selected a bond on the basis of facts which have become evident after the date of purchase, so that it cannot be supposed that an investor in 1902 could have made so fortunate a selection. The bond chosen is Virginia Iron, coal and coke 5% due 1949, which sold in April 1902 on a basis to yield 10% when high-grade bonds were selling on a basis to yield less than 4%. So far, our investor would feel that his foresight in 1902, if it would be called such, had been rewarded by a handsome increase in the capital value of his investment. But if he then made inquiry as to what he could buy with the proceeds of the sale of his bond, as compared with the smaller number of dollars which he invested in 1902, would have bought at the time he invested them, he might not be quite so well pleased. The dollar in 1920 had only 37% of the purchasing power of the 1902 dollar. So 37% times 154.7% equals 57.24%. In spite of appearing to have made 54.7% gain in the real principal value of his investment, he in fact lost almost 43% of it. In this instance, a great improvement in the basis upon which the bond sold, which could be due only to an improvement in its credit position, overcame a general tendency toward higher interest rates, but was more than offset by an appreciated dollar. It is recognized that thus to assign definite mathematical ratios to the fluctuations in the purchasing power of the dollar is to enter a field in which controversy runs high as to which of various methods for measuring such fluctuations may be considered valid. Using figures derived from the U.S. Department of Labor index numbers for wholesale commodity prices, we have chosen the most convenient method available. All agree that the dollar fluctuates, and the results of these studies must be the same in principle, no matter what method is used to compute its fluctuations. There is no intention in these pages of endorsing this particular method of estimating the practical effect of change in dollar values. With this understanding, we may summarize the results of these illustrations. This summary shows in general terms what happened to investments in bonds made in 1902. And while most investors who bought bonds at or near that time are aware of a part of their losses, they do not all realize the underlying causes involved, nor the force with which they operated against them up to the year 1920. So bonds 1902 to 1913. The illustrations so far given have covered a period of extreme decline in bond values due to rising interest rates, as well as to depreciation in the purchasing power of the dollar, and so may be justly criticized as not representing an average or even a typical period. The purpose in choosing this extreme period has been to show to what an extent the principle of an investment in bonds is subject to shrinkage. But in order to show that a great war is not necessary to produce similar losses, it may be well to see what happened to principal values invested in high-grade bonds in 1902 if sold in December 1913 before the war became a factor. We again choose the Atchison and New York Central bonds of our first illustrations. But the purchasing power of the 1913 dollar was only about 84% of the purchasing power of the 1902 dollar. Hence, the percentage of the real principal value of the original investment still held in 1913 was as follows. It appears then that if we regard the purchasing power of the money invested as the real measure of the investment, nearly 23% of such investment would have been lost in the Atchison bond, more than 37% of it in the New York Central bond in a period that was not shaken by any world catastrophe, 1902 to 1913, and yet the bonds had been purchased on a basis justified only by the supposition that their holders were free from any risk of loss in principal values. Does this mean that bonds are not to be considered as sound investments at any time? Far from it. There have been periods when bondholders have profited greatly from favorable underlying conditions, periods during which the dollar increased in purchasing power while general interest rates were tending downward. So profits in bonds, 1866 to 1885. In connection with our test number 5, a group of high-grade bonds were assumed to have been bought in January 1866 and sold in December 1885 after yielding an average net income of 6.07% on the original investment. These bonds showed an increase in dollar market value of approximately 23.65%, so that the market value of the holdings in 1885 stood at 123.65% of the original investment. Meanwhile, the purchasing power of the dollar had increased to such an extent that the dollar of 1885 would buy 224% as much as that of 1866. An investor in these bonds then had, during this period, improved the real value of his principal. The other group of bonds, which we studied, were selling on a somewhat higher income basis in 1866, showing that they were not then regarded as of the best credit standing. These showed a gain in principal value by December 1885 measured in dollars, amounting to $3,000 on an original investment of $9,140, or approximately 32.8%. Thus, the holdings stood in December 1885 at 132.8% of the original investment after yielding an average annual income of 6.9% on that investment. Applying the increased purchasing power of the 1885 dollar, we find that the holdings in 1885 represented an improvement in position of 132.8% times 224% minus 100%, or 197.4%. Thus, between 1866 and 1885, we have our bondholders gaining both in dollar values as a result of falling interest rates and in the actual purchasing power of these dollars, while from 1902 to 1920 they lost heavily because of reverse tendencies in these two great underlying factors. The percentages of loss and of gain to holders of bonds are larger than those which are customarily associated with bonds, and some who view the economists with a suspicious eye may say that the change in value of the dollar is a theoretical and not a practical loss or gain. It is well to ask these whether the loss in purchasing power of the mark was a theoretical or a practical matter to the holders of German maturities payable in marks, and to ask them further whether they believe that an income of $5,000 today is equal to an income of $5,000 in 1900 in the degree of social satisfaction it will afford. In this connection, the following item from the New York Times of June 7, 1924 furnishes food for thought. Exaggerated and fantastic as are all transactions in German marks, they nevertheless serve to emphasize factors which are too often overlooked in their more moderate manifestations. 500 billion% dividend declared by Berlin's Railways. The General Local Railway and Power Works Corporation of Berlin has declared a 500 million% dividend on its common stock. Translated into terms of real money, the dividend represents $1.20 a share of 1,000 marks value. Previous to the war, the same company paid a dividend of 10%, which was then equivalent to $24 a share, according to figures obtained by the Foreign Department of Moody's Investor Service. Present holders of the 6% preferred stock of the company, regarded as a high-grade investment prior to the war, have been receiving 6% per annum for the last year. This is equivalent to 60 trillionths of one gold mark. The entire issue of preferred stock recently was repurchased by the company. It would seem that enough illustrations have been offered to dispel the idea that an investment in bonds was likely to remain of constant value, or that the selection of bonds of highest credit standing was any protection against the more important elements tending toward changing values, which are to be found in the underlying economic conditions controlling the purchasing power of the dollar and the tendency toward higher or lower interest rates. And that's the end of chapter 12. Yeah, this is